Hello. So I'm very excited to be talking with June Bellamy today. June is a South African activist and she is a whistleblower who worked for Samsung and spoke out against bullying and corruption and was fired and has dealt with a pretty tough battle fighting Samsung in South Africa, but remains resilient and positive even though she's facing a lot of financial uncertainty, homelessness. She recently launched a GoFundMe as she pursues this battle against Samsung. We're going to talk a little bit about her experience with Samsung and also her broader thoughts on the culture around whistleblowing and workplace bullying, corruption, and even as a South African, seeing all of this new South African influence in the US government. So thank you, June.
Thank you always for inviting me and the time. It's always difficult for whistleblowers to get a platform, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So let's start with Samsung and what you did when you were there, and what was the catalyst that led to this to you having to whistleblow.
I started there in 2013 and I was in the camera division for a number of years. I was hired as the trainer, and that division became defunct. And I had a good record, as we always do, performance awards and the like. And there was an opening in the service division for another trainer, and this time it was the empathy trainer. And that had been piquing my interest as I was shifting into that sphere unknowingly. So I applied for that position as the empathy trainer, doing a little bit of marketing, got that position, started there, and very quickly, within a few weeks, I kept on hearing this narrative and complaints from staff members that had been in that division for a long time. So you're not going to rock the boat. You keep your head down. You're, on your 3 months probation, but you're always listening. And when I went out into trade to the some of the franchise service departments, they were raising concerns with me that I was unaware of, and they were asking me to please speak up for them and look into these things. And in a sense, it was confusing. It was a confusing time for me because I was new in the department and what the service division was about, but I learned that very quickly. And I've been in the service, component and arena for many years of my life. And when you start putting the pieces together of what people are saying, you start looking at this and going, but this isn't right. What's happening isn't right, and it's going to affect a whole lot of people. And it's not only the people that are going to lose their jobs. It obviously has a knock-on effect to their families. So where 100 people possibly lose their job, you're affecting 600 with their spouses, their children, everything. So that's where I started, you know, listening to what people were saying and um, trying to get an understanding of what they were all talking about.
Yeah, so can you tell me a little bit about what were some of the biggest red flags? And it's also curious, that they would hire an empathy coach or trainer, but then not want to hear the results of what that person had to share.
The irony is never lost on me. So the red flags were certain words that were being used to describe effectively the group of people that were part of this plan. And if you look at South Africa state capture, any kind of corruption has the few leaders, and then they surround themselves with people that they trust, people that are going to bring in other people and protect the leader of the group. So you've got these people that are hired, and what effectively happens is you get a lot of nepotism and cronyism. So you're hiring your mates, you're hiring your family members, they're not qualified, but they are going to protect the leader at the time. And these people are often easily corruptible. We talk about ethics, and ethics is teachable, and you can roll out ethics all you want in a company, and you can tick that box. But the shift comes when you have to speak out. Then it becomes a question of your moral compass, your moral integrity. If you have ethics, but you aren't prepared to actually act on it, then the ethics become mute. So you have this scenario where it's like a wheel. You have your leader in the middle, and your spokes and the people just going out doing all the dirty deeds. But of course, the agenda is set by those in power, and that's what you need to be careful of, and that's what you need to piece together. And a lot of times, you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. I only found out some crucial elements a year after I'd been dismissed. And in that time, you think you still experience a lot of gaslighting because you're missing pieces that you didn't even know you were missing, and you don't even know that you have to look for. And luckily for me, as when I've left, more people have come to me and given me evidence that's allowed me to piece together a big part of the reasons why I was removed so quickly and the director was protected at the time.
Why do you think they then hired an empathy trainer in the first place? What do you think they wanted you to do? And then when you presented your results, what was the feedback?
So the empathy position is something that they've had for a while, especially in the service. When Samsung rates, has their scorecard, all the different branches, all the different countries, um,
Mm-hmm.
the service obviously gets a scorecard. Now, in relation to your phone and your service, the speed of it, if there's a delay, if it takes a long time, you're going to get scored low. And a lot of the times, the empathy rating is judged in parallel to that. And you don't often see the empathy rating higher because when your customer's angry, everything about it, they rate poorly. And while I was there, I designed a new empathy program. It hadn't been done before, and for the first time, the empathy rating became higher, especially where the service, the speed, and waiting for parts, all that type of thing was low. So the
Right.
position was there, and the the empathy in service is a difficult thing to master because again, when you're angry, and you take it out on the company, on the brand. So the challenge was there, but with my years in customer service, and I'd started working with mindfulness, which is
Mm-hmm.
all about compassion, empathy, and understanding the other. And those are the components that I put together. So the challenge for me was getting that right, which I did. Again, the irony was that there's no empathy for the whistleblower when they speak up against something that the company as a whole is doing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So the empathy is definitely lacking when it comes to whistleblowers, despite the fact that myself as an empathy trainer was there for customer service. But their
Mm-hmm.
own loyalty to their own employees is what has no empathy, especially, and I say this all the time, they will always place profit over people. And Samsung
Right.
is no different. It's always profit over people.
Right. Right. So what you were doing, it sounds like it was somewhat revolutionary in that you were pushing for empathy that they didn't. Maybe they were okay with empathy for the customer, but not so much empathy for the employees, even if the employees were flagging something that ultimately would impact the customer. So then tell me, the retaliation and the ostracizing of you and what then went on and like the toll and the effect that that's taken on you in the years to come because this happened in 2017, right?
Right. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's been a long time, and that's if you look around at most of the whistleblowers, we don't get resolution, and we don't resolve this in a year or two. A lot of
Right.
these battles 7, 10 years or more, and they do that on purpose to try and drain you and financially decimate you. After I whistleblew, I had pre-approved leave. I went on study leave for a week, and then I took annual leave. So that was 2 weeks. When I came back, on the day I came back, I got an email from my manager at the time, and HR was copied in on this manager, and they were accusing me of citing staff against this director.
Mm-hmm.
So it started immediately. What I didn't know at the time is in those 2 weeks, the director did his own investigation. He pulled people into his office without HR present. He pressured them, he bullied them to find out what was going on, who was looking for X, Y, and Z. Because at the same time, after I'd already whistleblown, the the investigation had started. And the fault with the auditors when they investigate is they go in and they ask you questions, and the questions are pointing him to what he had to cover up. So,
Right.
and also in asking those questions, you can work it backwards and you can go, okay, well, this particular piece of information could only have come from this department, and there's only 2 or 3 people in that department. And that's one of the biggest flaws of whistleblowing, is that, especially when it's a small division, you can easily narrow it down to 2 or 3 people, and you can bring those people in one at a time, and you can pressure them. Always remember that people need their jobs, they need their financial security, they've got their families. So it's not a question of them lacking the capability or the ethics to stand up. I
Mm-hmm.
100% see that people have to protect their jobs. And that's
Mm-hmm.
always what the company relies on, is that threat of losing your job. So the the retaliation started straight away, and I think what surprised me the most is going back to the auditors and telling them that it started. You've got a leak somewhere. You need to protect me. And straight away they said to me, "Sorry, you're on your own. Get an attorney." And I was in such
Mm.
disbelief, because when you do your
Had they
as
fired you yet at this point?
no,
Or
no,
they
no,
had not fired you? Yeah.
no, that happened a year later. So that was a year of retaliation. So the problem lies in that when you do your training with any company, you've got these beautiful policies in place and all the rest of it. What a company never tells you is that when we, the company, don't protect you, this is what you need to do. Because the assumption is that that will never happen. And we're naive if we think that it doesn't happen, because the first thing that happens to us is we're retaliated against. And the other thing about anonymity, you're trying to seek help, but you've technically got nobody to go to help for, because you're supposed to be anonymous. So,
Right, right.
so even
You have to wonder with some of these tip lines whether they really are anonymous, and even if, they are anonymous, then the information you share could be so specific
yeah,
that it would be hard to ultimately preserve that anonymity.
that whole concept is flawed, because most of those tip lines are paid for by the company. And
Right.
again, if you give that information back to the company and say, "Listen, we found a problem," what the company does with that is then fully in their control. So the whole, tip,
Okay.
and the same principle applies, is if somebody has made that tip, which division is it? Who could have possibly made it? And straight away, you know who to start targeting. So that whole
Right.
concept is flawed. It's nice on paper, but it
Yeah.
doesn't work, because companies are not enforcing the protection component of it.
Right. Okay, so you were retaliated against for a year. They said get an attorney. And then what happened? Like what then was the final push that led them to fire you? And did you get an attorney?
Well, in the beginning, no. I was like, what do I need an attorney for? The company is going to protect me. That's what they train us on every year.
Right.
Samsung South Africa, they don't have whistleblowing policies in writing. It's all done verbally. So you've got nothing to refer to. And you going through, I think, in a sense, you're in a bit of a haze. There's a lot of disbelief. And that's where, and I call it now, the language of whistleblowing. We don't know what's happening to us because you're not taught this and you're not told about this when you taught about whistleblowing, because the retaliation is not supposed to happen. So straight away, and this is where, Jackie Garrick's book, the psychosocial impact of whistleblowing
Mm-hmm.
retaliation, has been vital information for me. And when we speak about this, is that now we know what the language is. Now, when you know what the language is, you can start to identify it. And I didn't know at the time, but there was gaslighting. You're given a task and then it's changed right at the end, or they pull your resources to do it. There's mobbing. You know, I love the term flying monkeys. People that you trusted
Yeah.
before, but now the director will send out and muddy the water. All these different things
Right.
happening. Every form of retaliation. They change your job scope. And as I was saying, they pull the resources, or they give you a very short time frame to execute work, all these types of things. But I think the worst thing for me, and I didn't realize, is you go in, because once I knew that they knew that I'd whistleblown. Now you're spending
Yeah.
every day on arrival. When you get into work, you're in a state of fight and appease.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't fight, I didn't run, and I didn't go into freeze. So now you're fighting, in a sense, to stay alert and do your job, but you also have to appease the bosses as if they don't know, but you know that they know. And the
Right.
mental stress of that was exponential. Just before I'd decided to whistleblow, ironically, I'd started getting so many migraines. I'd never gotten migraines in my life. I actually went for an
Mm.
MRI because the pain in my head and my body was excruciating. And the neurologist said to me, it's stress. So you experience all these different things, you don't know what they are, and yet somewhere
Yeah.
you still believe that the company's going to help you. So I kept on going back to the auditors, what are you going to do? They're retaliating, and they're just throwing their hands up. And later on, I found out that the HR directors also knew that I was a whistleblower. That in
Mm-hmm.
itself, I didn't know what to do with that because they weren't supposed to know. I eventually took it all the way to the president at the time, Sun Yun, and in his office, begging him, telling him, I'm a whistleblower, you have to protect me. What are you going to do to protect me? In tears. 2 meetings I had with him. And his solution was to instruct HR to investigate themselves, because I had listed HR and the auditors and my managers and the directors, everybody. I think there were about 8 or 9 people at that time that were all colluding and retaliating against me. So when your solution is to investigate yourself, there's no justice there.
It's comical. That's insane.
And yet they do it
Um,
all the time. They do it all the time.
right, right. So, when you ended up, finally leaving Samsung, what is it within you that has given you the energy to fight for now 7 years? I mean, that's a long time to fight this one company.
I think it's always been part of my makeup. I've never liked bullies. I've always stood up against bullies. I often say, my whole life of standing up against bullies has, in a sense, prepared me to stand up against one of the biggest bullies in the world. If you look at their history, also, their president is corrupt. They've He's been to jail for corrupting the South Korean government, and they have a
Hmm.
long history of that, going to jail, being pardoned. So I started to look around, and I actually started seeing more information about Samsung that I'd not known before. Notably, the president's repeatedly been found guilty of corruption, going to jail and
Hmm.
being pardoned. And I think it didn't sit well with me. And of course, at the same time, we had state capture, so there was a lot in the press coming out about the whistleblowers and what was happening to us. In South
Hmm.
Africa, sadly, we have a very high rate of assassinations, and there's so little that whistleblowers know of what is actually going to potentially happen to us. And, we started an informal support group, and then reached out to people overseas, other whistleblowers. And that's when I suppose my interest in it became a combination of protecting myself more, understanding what was going on, and then how can I help others? Always trying to make it better for those who come, after us. I think that's what we have a very strong legacy in the Archbishop Tutu and Madiba. So South Africans are we fighters. We don't back down, and just because you're a global you know superpower and behemoth of a corporate doesn't mean that you can't be knocked down a peg and be taught a couple of lessons. I was also looking at Uber at the time. There were a lot of cases coming out, and also I've been following, the Harvey Weinsteins, the NDAs. There's a link with everything where you continue to try to silence those that have done wrong and they get to leave. So there's the legal justice system across the globe is lacking, and while a lot of countries in South Africa as well, we are putting in, we looking at the changes and the mechanisms. There's still a lot of gaps and very simple things to do that people aren't considering. So it's my
Yes.
creative brain that is wants to puts my hand up and goes, listen, this is what your law says. This is where the failures are, but here's a way that you can actually adjust it. So I think
Yeah.
taking on Samsung for this long, it's partly also because I represent myself. I can't afford an attorney, so I've learned a lot about the legal system. But it's purely the bullying factor. I think the fact that they think they can get away with this um, is it's disgusting to me that whistleblowers, repeatedly are financially decimated, and for decades now, they just get away with it. So it's time we actually shift the whole dynamic of what happens when we get retaliated, when they leak our identities, because they always do, and how can you actually change that whole system? Because there's a lot that we can change. The
Yeah.
policymakers must just actually be a bit more courageous and use these examples of Samsung and Boeing to really hone in on poor leadership and really start to make some, tangible changes.
Yes. So I'm wondering, with your specific case, and a lot of people have faced this too, mental health struggles that lead to potential inability to get future work, being blackballed from an industry so they can't afford basic living expenses. Like, can you break down for you, like, what has happened financially in the last few years? Like, what was your before and after financial outlook?
So before, I wasn't a millionaire. The flat that I'm in right now, which is going to be auctioned off on the 1st of April, it's a modest flat, nothing very expensive, but I was comfortable. I wasn't wanting for anything. I'm single. I'm not married. Don't have a partner. So it was a comfortable, living space. Within within the first month of being dismissed, I cashed in my pension immediately, and that is obviously now depleted because that was in 2018 that I was dismissed. So your future plans, your pension's now depleted. The way the creditors come after you is another stress and trauma that you have to manage, and that's compounded by the fact that your family doesn't understand why you've done what you've done, and they just keep on saying, "Let it go and go get a job." What I've also now come to learn, I didn't know at the time. I thought I'd give myself a few months, take a breather, and then go get another job. But I didn't realize that I've got PTSD because my battlefield is the working environment now. Doesn't matter if it's a corporate or if it's just an entry level retail job, that's where my PTSD lies. So you now can't go back to get another job because just reading job descriptions causes me anxiety. So I can't even apply for them because straight away my PTSD kicks in and I won't put myself in that position again. So I've had to reinvent myself,
Mm-hmm.
so you have to re-educate, reinvent. But because you are now financially decimated, that has a knock-on effect with everything. Because without finances, you can't look after your mental health. And
Mm-hmm.
where you under physical threat, you also can't hire bodyguards and that type of thing, which I haven't had. I have had spotters outside my property who were videoing that type of thing. I did luckily get some free training, which allowed me to even notice that and to notice if you've been followed home, that kind of thing. But because your finances then get totally decimated, your ability to go back to work is taken away. You lose all sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it got very bad in a point. It was, I think, 2022, which I call my suicidal year because that was my greatest battle. I was estranged from my family. Um, there was just the court battles, trying to take, the flat away, the car away, everything. There's literally nobody to talk to. I didn't have a consistent psychologist or anything like that. And that that in and of itself is, I think, the hardest thing. But your lack of finances pushes you to that point, and also the fact that you don't want to burden the family that you have with everything that you're going through, because now you're also watching them, because the ripple effect and the knock-on effect is that where I was contributing to care for my mom and that type of thing, now your sibling has to take on all of that burden. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that I never foresaw. I didn't even think would happen. And this is all centered around the fact that Samsung has created this situation. It is
Mm-hmm.
wholly their doing. And you have to then battle that shame, so that you can try and start to function. And also, how can I start contributing again to myself so that I can start my earning potential? It's been a very it's and the also the pressure from people going, let it go, get over it, go get another job. People are going to respond to this differently, different timelines. I'm one of the strongest women I know mentally, and it breaks you down in a way that you can never imagine. And then you have to rebuild yourself with a big chunk of your life and your trust being completely decimated. So it affects too many areas that you have no idea that will even touch.
Yeah.
It's I don't
And
the
so,
what's kept me going. I think what's kept me going is um, resilience of people that you look up to. And I'd
Mhm.
say my parents, but it's things that has been installed in you. And I
Yeah.
just don't want to see this bully carry on doing what they're doing to other employees.
Have you heard from a number of other employees at Samsung? Have you become like a clearinghouse in a way for stories?
Um, some are, some just reach out and say, keep going.
Mm,
Um, others will say, others have given me evidence, like I've said. Others will say, I used to work there and I saw some strange things and, I left. Um, so it validates me in a sense because I often do what I call poster protests outside their offices. Um,
mm-hmm.
Specifically around lunchtime because that's when a lot
Yeah.
of the employees come walking past. And just also, remembering that a lot of the employees when I was there have now moved on, especially the attorney
Mm-hmm.
who did nothing to assist me, knowing full well that I was a whistleblower. He's gone to another company, but so the ones coming out, it's just a warning to them, that Samsung does not protect their whistleblowers. So don't believe, anything that's said. And like I say, even if just one of them stops and reads it, they will think twice about whistleblowing there, because while companies need it, it does protect the brand and it protects their bottom line. If they're not going to protect the whistleblowers, then don't speak out. Let the corruption and unethical behavior manifest, and look for another job and leave the toxicity behind.
You had mentioned to me that ethics training, for example, is actually not a good use of of companies' time. And there's this whole conversation here about getting rid of DEI programs, and certainly there's some problematic DEI programs, but also there were some that were actually doing a lot of good and there were misconceptions about them. But I'm wondering, what do you think has to happen if, and I agree completely that some of these, I once, as a manager in the state of California, had to go through a sexual harassment training. And at that point in my career, I had probably been sexually harassed more times than I could remember. So I was watching this training and I was like, this is absurd. Like, it was laughable because, like, this just would never happen. It was so overt, like, and the videos were so overt, and certainly sexual harassment can be overt, but I was like, it never goes down like this. What are you talking about? Like, they're so stupid. So I am curious to hear your thoughts on, what, as somebody who has a background in this, maybe one day you go back into this line of work, working with companies, but what works and what doesn't?
Mm. There's a lot. There's a lot in that question that has no answer. There's a lot in that question where there is answers, but the companies don't want to hear them, and they won't allow real answers and people with real solutions to come in, because it will most certainly point to the leadership style. Um, and a lot of the division that takes you expect to assist you is HR, and human resources is they're people themselves. They have to protect their own jobs. So towing the company line, um, and keeping your own job is where ethics has no place, because if everybody had to speak up ethically every time they would see these things, you wouldn't have anybody left in the company, because there's too much that goes wrong.
Totally. But I imagine there has to be a world in which, in any workplace, whether it's a for-profit or non-profit or
Mm,
even in a family, like there are problems, and
mm,
but there are ways to handle those problems that just leads to like chaos and destruction and
mm,
abuse. And then there are ways to handle those situations where it leads to something productive or something
mm,
that's not just purely abusive, And I spoke to the other week. I spoke to the whistleblower lawyer for the Boeing whistleblowers, and he told me like, look, Boeing could still make so much money if they addressed these things.
yep,
It's not a matter of like this whistleblower claim or this situation will put us out of business.
mm,
It's a matter of, you know, do they choose to do something that's maybe a little more time intensive in the short term to help people and not think of them as disposable,
mm,
or do they treat them as disposable? Because they'll make money either way, but they'll, from a long term vantage point, I would imagine, make more money if they're not just discarding people and there's high
mm,
turnover. And so I do feel like there's the idea of making money while treating people not with this just horrific form of retaliation, and to isolate someone like what you were experiencing with the migraines and the health conditions, like that is like a torture tactic that
mm,
can be used in like certain prisons, like, right? Isolating people from the rest of the population. It's like psychological warfare that they're engaged in. And they don't have to do that. Like they can still fire people and say, okay, we agree to disagree that, but they don't have to do it in this sadistic way.
Yeah. The I happened to read a new article about the Boeing about John Bonnet this morning, and I sent it to. I have supporting it with a psychologist now, and I sent it to her, and I said to her, "This is my story.
Mm,
It's my story because when I when I saw that he was, I didn't know that he'd been alone for 2 weeks before he testified.
mm-hmm,
Straight away, you're isolated. You got a lot of time to think. You're then bullied for a whole day, 7 hours of testimony. That it destroys you. It destroys you because, in a part, for me, I would think, is anybody going to believe me? Is the legal system going to believe me? Because
mm-hmm.
his retaliation, had been dismissed. They didn't see that as being truthful. And that is a massive problem, especially in the legal side of things. Judges don't know what to look for. It's the whole
Mm-hmm.
DAVO thing, deny, attack, reverse victim offender, which is applicable in, divorce cases, but it's happening in business as well. So
Right.
they're dismissive of our experience because they don't know what it is we're going through. Um,
Yes.
and on top of all of that, when you say, surely there's something that can happen. And, when he was saying, why won't nobody believe me? How can they be doing this? Because, again, the aircrafts are one thing, and it is when you said, it could be somebody's mother, daughter, son, father. These are people's lives that you're playing with. So when your product is faulty, and I
Right.
only found that out, like I said, a year later, that they were covering up faulty product. This director was covering up faulty product, and I happened to speak out against him on other issues. And because he was covering up faulty product, they chose to save him. But now,
Mm.
covering up the faulty product because
Is
you
this
don't want
the
to.
washing machine?
Yes,
The washing
yeah,
machine? Yeah.
correct. And you you are now playing God with people's lives. And,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be a washing machine that's going to explode, and damage you, which has happened with people, or the Boeing aircraft that crashes, these corporates are playing with people's lives. So when you
Yeah.
say, how do you get that ethics component right? It has to be beyond ethics because you can train ethics, as I've said before. You can train that. You can also train compassion. Now, when you're coming up against the entire division, all your bosses are against you. That's a fault you cannot change. But the
Yeah.
one area for me where I see there can be a shift is, in South Africa you can whistleblow and then leave, or you can leave and then whistleblow. I think you have to take yourself out of that environment. You need to be removed from that
Mm.
environment so you're not going through that trauma and retaliation on a daily basis. The
Right.
problem is that, and I saw this dismantling now in February. What's the first thing that the government does is they dismantle, your whistleblowing protection entity. You take away your first responders because I call whistleblowers, we are the mavericks, whistleblowers, we are the mavericks, and we are your first responders. But we're going in as first
Mm-hmm.
responders with no backup and no tools. We literally go in there by ourselves because we have to be
Yeah.
anonymous. So for me, you have to shift the entire dynamic and say, um, there's something wrong at the company. I'm going to report it. If the retaliation starts straight away, that entity, which is what the UK is looking at and South Africa is also looking at, that entity, not a legal body, you don't have to go through the court system. They can go straight to Samsung, for example, and say, you've started retaliating. Yes, she's a whistleblower. We are going to remove her until you finish your investigation, whether that be a month, 2 years, 6 years, or whatever it is. So we get taken out of the equation and we don't experience the retaliation because that's their go-to.
Right.
That's their go-to move.
Totally. To basically like give whistleblowers the protection, financial, mental, psychological. I mean, even if you're leaving your job, you don't have as much financial protection, but at least you're out of that environment that's
Mm.
quite literally causing you to be sick. So
Literally,
you're even more handicapped.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so final question for you. What is your hope for the next? I mean, it's been a really difficult 5+ years for you. What is your hope, both like you just mentioned something that can be changed on a more societal policy level, but for you personally, for your case, for the future, what do you hope for?
Right. So I like to get, I'm an out the box thinker. I'm creative like that.
Hmm.
So I'm attacking this and, dissecting it from various levels. So over the last 3 weeks, I have been calling out the retailers that stock Samsung in South Africa. All of them have code of conduct policies for suppliers. In all of these code of conduct policies, they talk about ethics and not being corrupt, all that type of thing. I'm asking, you know, if I can't get my case to courts, anytime soon, I'm going to be warning people. I'm going to be speaking my truth. But I am now trying to put pressure on the retailers, that stock Samsung, to do their own investigation as to why I'm calling them unethical. Because if you can sue me for defamation, because then we have to go to court and the evidence will come out, which is why they're not doing it. But now putting pressure on those that are stocking Samsung. You need to start boycotting the product. You need to cease, stocking it until you've done your own research as to why they are unethical. Otherwise, all these big brands are now complicit in not adhering to their own code of conduct policies for
Have
supporters.
any of them responded to you that you've called out? Any of the
Not yet,
retailers?
not yet. And I offer them
Okay.
right to reply. I know they're watching. I know they're seeing the posts. But
You
there's
should go to
been
Samsung's competitors and be like, well,
That's exactly
yeah.
what I've said in one of my posts. If there's no Samsung fridge there and you need a fridge, you're going to go buy Defy, LG, whoever. If you don't have the phone, the other brands are as powerful. Apple, Huawei, Oppo.
Hmm.
They've all got options. So, in a sense, it also
Right.
becomes a consumer. The consumer can also boycott. But for right
Yes.
now, what I hope is, I'm still trying to secure an attorney for my equality case. Um, and that's also precedence. I'm trying to see what we can do there for South Africa's restorative justice. We're not punitive, and that's something that companies need to be, held responsible. Is what damage have you done to me financially? But as John Barnett said, you cannot quantify the damage you've done to my entire life. Um,
Hmm.
how do you put a number on that? And I think a big part of it is that companies, even when they're billion-dollar companies, they need to start paying for the damage that they're doing to us, specifically
Hmm.
the whistleblowers. But
Yeah.
more than that, I'm trying to find the courts are trying to find the high courts trying to find an attorney to allocate for that case, so I can get that on the books. Um, and and then as my place to stay, I don't know what's going to happen here
Mm.
because I've also experienced another what they call sanctuary trauma because I stay in a block of flats and I'm in arrears here. So for the last nearly 3 years now, I've experienced a lot of trauma here. I get sworn at. They try and lock me out the building. They change the remote codes. And for a whistleblower, being able to get quickly, access into your building quickly, is very important for us. Um,
Right.
so yeah, it's literally, that happens on the 1st of April. But until then, I put together my business plans to hopefully train people and educate them on not only because the bullying and the whistleblowing goes hand in hand. You know,
Right.
bullying a staff member is for whatever reasons you have, but it's not covert. It's overt now. It's in the
Yeah.
workplace. It's in your face. So there's a lot of parallels. So there's a lot of things that can be done. It's a
Yeah.
question of focusing my time on that and not
Yeah.
you know you know having depressive days. And I'll tell you now. Yesterday I couldn't get out of bed. It was just one of those days, and that's what we live with. I've had my own suicidal ideations, and it's what we live with now. So going forward, it's to hold Samsung accountable in some respect, whether it's just me voicing my opinion and you know sharing my lived experience with them and warning people, then so be it. And if Samsung had any conscience, they would do the right thing. But if you look at the playbook, a big bully business never does. So we'll see what
Right.
happens.
Yes, well, you're a very brave woman. And one final question. Any advice for us over here with Elon Musk puppeteering our government?
Well, I've pondered this question because it's people are corruptible. What's happening now is happening in plain sight. These the oligarchs are out there and they're not hiding anymore. So that's a particular kind of unhealthy, narcissistic, arrogance and ego-driven agenda. Um, just remembering, it doesn't happen overnight. These workings and
Mm,
plans have been going on for quite a while. It doesn't happen in a silo. And what we had here, state capture, where your government is captured. Um,
mm,
it is never done in isolation. There is more often than not always a corporation involved, and
mm-hmm.
that's what I think we're busy watching unfolding now.
Yep. A nepotism, as you called out when you were there. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much, June.
Thank you very much for
Hang
your
in there.
time. Thank you. I will.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.